So in this video I'm going to be looking at how I do backstitch. This is a form of stitch that's often used as an outline, or it could be used to add tiny details to existing motifs like this. So let me show you how to do it. So before you start the backstitch, you want to check the pattern to see how many strands of thread. So quite commonly you use 2 strands of thread for the cross stitch and 1 strand of thread for the backstitch, but always check with the pattern first. And then on the actual pattern, you can see all of these lines here that aren't the grids of the cross stitch pattern. These individual kind of outlining lines are what will be done in backstitch. And they can be done for a whole range of reasons. So they can be adding little detail on the flowers, I'll show it on here. So they can be adding little detail on the flowers through to kind of creating outlined around the shapes. So I'm going to show you how to do it. And again, this is just how I do it. And I think it comes down to having a play and see what works best for you. So I have got 1 strand of thread and it's all threaded up. Now I like to tie a knot when I start, and that's because I kind of like the stability of it. So you could just tie a knot at the end of your thread as normal. I tend to find that it comes through the hole in the Ada. So the way that I do this is I go underneath, trying to see if I can get this into focus. So I go underneath one of the stitches that's already done and pull it through. And then here, so you've got the end of your 1 strand ready for the back stitch, and then this side is on the needle. So I'm just going to tie this together. So I've put 2 sides together. So I'm going to cross the thread over, and then I'm putting the thread through that loop, almost like that first stage of tying the shoelaces. And then I'm going to do it for a second time. So I've crossed it over again, created the loop and passed the end through. So for me, securing the knot onto one of the existing stitches sort of makes it more stable, but again it's just finding what works for you, and then you can trim down any of that excess. So then you are ready to start stitching. So looking at a pattern in relation to backstitch is very different to how you look at it for cross stitch. So when looking at it for cross stitch, you would see that you have got 4 yellow cross stitches going across, and you look at the whole square to show you where a whole cross stitch would go. When it comes to backstitch, you want to look at the corners of each square. So each corner counts as a different hole on your Ada. So you can see here that this would be where the 2 cross stitches are joining. And the back stitch, I'm going to start here at this point, so I go 1 hole above this middle join. So I'm going to start off by doing a straight stitch. So I've secured my thread at the back. That is that centre hole that I pointed out. I'm then going to go up 1 hole on the Ada and pull the thread through. And then you go back to the pattern and count where the next stitch goes. So I can see that that would be 1 hole, 2 holes, and then you go across 1 to the right. So on the Ada I would then go 1, 2 and across 1, and then take the needle back down. So that would be your starting stitch. That's a straight stitch. Then it becomes back stitch, kind of moving forward. So I've taken the needle down here. I then come up, it goes across 1 and up 1. So counting that across on the Ada, it would then going across 1 would take me to there, and then going up 1 would go to there. And this is where it becomes a back stitch, because you always take the stitch back to the previous stitch. So I'm coming up, pulling the needle through and taking it back down to form the back stitch. And then for the same for the next one, it went across 1 to the right. So you would count across 1, hold on the Ada, take your needle through, and then you're taking it back to that previous stitch. I can see on the next one it goes down 2, so I will count 2 of the holes on the Ada going straight down and then taking it back to that stitch. And then sometimes they the stitches will go diagonally, so I've just got to here and you can see it goes across diagonally by 1 and then diagonally by the second one. Now I always think it's down to personal preference. You could do an individual back stitch coming up there and taking it down there and coming up there and taking it back there. It's completely up to you. Sometimes I think doing it across several sort of means that your stitches won't get lost. It kind of makes it more of a free-flowing stitch. I wouldn't recommend doing it more than groups of 4, but again, I think that's down to personal preference and kind of how you prefer to do it. So you kind of keep working and taking it back to the previous stitch. So my top tips for doing it would be to practice looking at the cross stitch differently. So rather than seeing that as a whole stitch now, like you would do in cross stitch, that would be a whole yellow stitch. You then want to look at these corners as individual holes on the Ada. And kind of whichever way you're doing it, whether you're doing it individually or across several at the same time, the aim with back stitch is that you always want to be taking the stitch back to meet the previous one. So then you would go there and take it back to meet where your previous stitch finished. And the idea is that on the back of your work, it should then create a similar sort of look to the front of it. And then I'll show you how I finish it off. So you can either run it through, so run it under a couple of the previous stitches. You can either tie it in a knot the normal way, or in the same way that I like to anchor it to an existing stitch when I started. That's how I tend to finish it too. So I will go underneath one of the stitches right before and pass the needle through once. I'll pass the needle through a second time, and before I pull it all the way through, you can see it's just created this loop here. And then what I'm going to do is just pass my needle through that loop, and I'm going to do that twice and then pull it, and you should be able to feel that it just made a teeny tiny knot, one that isn't going to stand out, and then you can snip your thread as you would normally do, and then your back stitch is complete. And it will look something like this. So you can see how it's added kind of the outline to the flower, or teeny tiny details to the bee, and outlines around the letters, shadow effects. So the possibilities are endless for backstitch, but it just creates a really nice different level to your cross stitch.